Welcome, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Ott, and thank you, Annie, and my sincerest gratitude to the Alzheimer's Association for sponsoring this every year and for allowing me this opportunity to share with you some hope of my own and research that I think is very intriguing and is a big draw for me to come into this field. And I completely agree with Dr. Ott. The fact that you're here, I see a lot of familiar faces, a lot of new faces, and the fact that you're here means that in one way or another you've been touched by Alzheimer's disease, and we all know that it's a devastating disease, and for a long time we've had a lot of work has gone into trying to, for many years, up until recently, there have been a lot of work has gone into figuring out what Alzheimer's disease is, what can we possibly do about it, but unfortunately, we've come up short over and over again. But we're in a new era. There is a lot of hope. There's a lot going on, and this is actually a great time to be starting a new career in the field. And I was hoping tonight to share with you some new insights and some new directions that Dr. Ott alluded to, mostly related to lifestyle risk factors for Alzheimer's disease. That might be a not entirely familiar term to you, but hopefully by the end of this, you'll understand what that means. And in explaining this, I'm going to give you, I think it's hard to understand what this all means without understanding, its general context within our general knowledge of Alzheimer's disease and where that knowledge has come from. So I'm going to take you on a little bit of a tour through the history of Alzheimer's research and get you up to date to where we are now. There's a lot of really interesting research. Almost every day I see something really interesting related to sleep or the gut microbiome or all these things and how they might be related to Alzheimer's disease. So I'm going to take you on a little tour. We'll end up there a little bit, and please do, we're going to be covering a lot of ground, so feel free to ask for questions, clarifications along the way, and obviously happy to answer any questions at the end. So the title of my talk today is a discussion for recent evidence for lifestyle risk factors for dementia. Before we do so, a little bit of a shout out to Dr. Ott. He already had an introduction, but the fact that I'm here is because of him. He's my mentor, and he's been tremendous, and I've learned an incredible amount. So shout out to Dr. Ott. So I've been interested, I got into medicine a little bit later in the game. I had a relatively short research career for a while. The plan actually was always to go into medical school, but I took a little bit of a detour for a while. I wanted to learn the ins and outs of molecular biology, cell biology. I did some research on brain pathology and neuropsychology and Alzheimer's disease. But I've always had this keen interest in preventive medicine. I think it's important. I think a lot of times in medicine we focus on treating symptoms, and it's important. It's very important, but a lot of times we don't address the root causes of problems. And I think we're at a point, I think a lot of medicine is moving in that direction. And Alzheimer's is recently no exception to that, but it's been a long time in coming. And as someone who's had had their eye out for this for a long time, I've been, over the past particularly year, I've been delighted with not only mention in small studies and newspaper articles here and there, but some really high-level press and research organizations have been starting to pay attention to this. About a year ago, I came across this article. This is in a journal called Nature, which is one of our top journals in all of science and medicine. This is Nature Outlook. They put together sort of short and friendly summaries for non-scientists to understand. And to see an olive oil bottle on the cover and the title, A Quest to Stave Off the Inevitable, and at the bottom, so if you can't read this, the subtitle here, it says, the idea that certain life choices could help to prevent Alzheimer's disease gaining broader acceptance. And this article went into detail a lot of the recent history that's gone along with you've probably heard of the Mediterranean diet and, of course, exercise and all these things. There's been sort of fits and starts with this research for a long time, but there's been a lot of victories lately that I'm gonna outline some of those for you. But really heartening to me to see things like, in the caption, they've got Mediterranean diet rich in olive oil might help to stave off Alzheimer's disease. So we're really, this is in journals like Nature. They're actually, we're talking about these things now. This is really exciting times. So that was exciting. So this past summer, just this past summer, I come across this announcement from the World Health Organization, not a small organization, the World Health Organization. So they have compiled a list of all of the lifestyle and vascular risk factor studies that have been done, and actually come out with guidelines for this. So the subtitle here, if you can't read it, says, New WHO, World Health Organization guidelines recommend specific interventions for reducing the risk of cognitive decline in dementia. So World Health Organization this summer puts out guidelines. They put out a pretty extensive analysis of all the different studies that have been done, and it's gotten to the point where we can actually have guidelines. So that's when you know you're getting someplace with a particular type of therapy. It's all well and good to talk about in research, which is great, which is what we do, but you've reached a certain level of success when you have guidelines. That's the whole point of this. And in fact, so they actually ended up publishing these guidelines. So risk reduction of cognitive decline, WHO guidelines, and I know this is going to be hard for you to read in the back, but I'm gonna read a lot of it for you. So they profiled a whole bunch of different types of interventions that have shown to have some promise with preventing dementia. Some of the ones I highlight right here are physical activity, tobacco cessation, nutritional interventions, interventions for alcohol use disorder, weight management, hypertension, diabetes, and dyslipidemia, which means basically high cholesterol. So I don't know if the list of recommendations might sound pretty familiar to a lot of you. So these are actually what we call vascular risk factors. They're the same recommendations that we've been giving for many years for people to prevent heart disease and stroke. So these are all vascular risk factors. So we've known for a long time that high blood pressure, high cholesterol, diabetes, smoking, getting older, being overweight, being less active than you should be are not great for heart health and also for strokes as well. So these are recommendations that have been given for many, many years to prevent those types of disorders as well as other chronic conditions with great success. But we've suspected for a long time that they might have something to do with Alzheimer's disease, but it's been a long time in coming. So it's actually gotten to the point where we have official recommendations for this. And some of these other recommendations here, social activity, depression, hearing loss, and I added on here sleep because that's another new one. Those also are, we could kind of unify these all in a way with stress. They're all can contribute to stress, can be caused by stress, and stress can actually increase your risk for vascular risk factors. Being more stressed can make you more hypertensive, et cetera. So it's all related in a way. But it's just really heartening to see this laid out in a World Health Organization series of recommendations. So this brings us to this is just a little bit of an introduction. This brings us to our talk. This is our outline for today. I basically like to walk you through how did we get here? How did we get to the point that we're talking about lifestyle risk factor modification is the term I'm going to use a lot for Alzheimer's disease. By modification, I mean you've got some kind of risk factor, so some kind of risk that puts you at higher chance of having something. How can you modify that risk? How can you make it make yourself less likely to be at risk for dementia? So first, we're going to have a basic talk. You always have to define what Alzheimer's disease and dementia are, even though you're all familiar with it, give you a little bit of a sense for the evolving science of Alzheimer's disease. It's been going on for, depending on how you look at it, at least 100 years. And then we're going to talk more about blood vessels in the brain. Why, we're talking about vascular risk factors, so it's blood vessels in the brain. So we're going to talk a little bit about how that's related. And then start talking in a little bit more detail about these vascular risk factors and where these studies have come from. And then we're going to take a little bit of a deeper dive into some of the more what I think some really exciting, interesting research that's been going on in recent years. We live in a wonderfully technologically advanced era. Some of the research capabilities that we have with our colleagues at Brown and other academic centers, it's really like living in the future right now. There's incredible stuff going on, and a lot of it's being applied to science related to Alzheimer's disease. And then just we're going to sort of wrap it up and talk a little bit more about our current optimism and sort of how the field has come full circle in certain ways. So first, basics in brief, dementia and Alzheimer's disease. So just to define, everyone always asks what's the difference between dementia and Alzheimer's disease. Dementia is not a disease itself, it's a description basically. So everybody becomes a little bit slower, a little bit more forgetful as they age. We expect that to a certain degree. But when somebody's memory and thinking problems get to the point where they can no longer function independently anymore in day-to-day life, we define that's what we call dementia, sort of regardless of the cause for that loss of functional independence. But for people who are in their 60s, 65 or older, by far the most common cause of dementia is Alzheimer's disease. Number one here, somewhere up around 70% or so is what I typically see quoted. Second to that is vascular dementia. So that's actually an entity in and of itself, and I'll go into what that means. Classically it means you've had something akin to a stroke or other sort of more major vascular event in the brain. And then there's a bunch of other of what we call neurodegenerative disorders. These are Alzheimer's is one of those. These are disorders that, for one reason or another, cause the brain essentially to age a lot quicker than it normally would, or parts of the brain. And it's not normal aging. So collectively, these are called neurodegenerative disorders. Lewy body disease, you may have heard of that. Frontotemporal dementia. There are a bunch of others, but those are basically the four most common. So this is actually the crux of the issue here. So we're talking about vascular risk factors for dementia, but classically, Alzheimer's disease and vascular dementia have been considered to be separate disease entities. But you may say, well, it's 2019, and you say you've been working, science has been working on this for 100 years or so. How could you not know that? Well, the brain turns out to be a pretty complicated thing to study. These are diseases that develop over decades and decades. Often the disease pathology happening in the brain several decades before you even realize you have symptoms. So it's hard to know, how do you know where to start? How do you know how to identify people who might have the earliest manifestations of the disease in their brain before they have outward symptoms? So it's a tremendously difficult and tricky topic. So we come down to sort of a dilemma here, and this is sort of the crux of the whole thing. So are Alzheimer's disease and vascular dementia, are they completely separate disorders, as has been presumed for much of our history, or are they one and the same, or are they similar? Are they separate, but do they have related factors that unite them in some ways? Recent evidence, I will argue, will suggest that they do appear to be somehow related and share some overlapping pathologies and risk factors and such. But this is a topic of actually enormous debate in our field. A lot of people have been thinking about this for a long time, and it's science. That's what we do. We come up with ideas. There are a lot of competing ideas. We debate them. At the end of the day, one camp's argument wins out over the other. They might prevail for a while, and then someone else comes up with a better argument. But right now, we've got to, as of, if you can't see this back here, 2019, this was probably 4 months ago, in Alzheimer's and Dementia. This is one of our top medical journals in Alzheimer's disease. Two opposing views, two position papers on this very topic. On the one hand, you've got a pretty big camp in the field saying, no, Alzheimer's type pathology and vascular pathology in the brain are not related. Alzheimer's disease is its own thing, and they've laid out some pretty sophisticated and really interesting research framework for how to define Alzheimer's disease from the standpoint of particular pathologies that we'll get into in a little bit. Got another camp here saying, well, yes, they are related. So these were two position papers that went out in a top journal pretty soon, very recently, just to give you an idea of the level of the debate in the field right now. So now, taking a step back, so this begs the question, so what is Alzheimer's disease? We kind of take the fact that we have a name, Alzheimer's disease, for granted that we know exactly what it is, but it's actually not so simple a thing to answer. So on a basic level, Alzheimer's disease, I mentioned to you, is a neurodegenerative disorder. So what does that mean? The brain on the right here, this is a normal brain. The brain on the left is an Alzheimer's, so this would be a more advanced, very advanced Alzheimer's disease brain. And I think even from the back row, you can probably see a pretty big difference between these two brains. This would be, probably this is a good-looking 30-year-old brain or so, or if you're really lucky, a really good 80-year-old brain, but probably not. But Alzheimer's disease, this is the classic sort of iconic picture of a severe Alzheimer's disease brain. You can see the whole brain is shrunken down, so it's degenerating, neurodegenerative disorder. So that's the simplest explanation for what Alzheimer's disease is: an age-related neurodegenerative disorder. You'll notice these yellow arrows here. That's a particularly important structure for us. That's called the hippocampus. This is a structure in the brain that is one of the parts of the brain that's primarily responsible for short-term memory, keeping new information from keeping new information in the brain, keeping it from leaving. And it's one of the parts of the brain that becomes affected earliest in Alzheimer's disease, and it's what gives you this characteristic short-term memory difficulty. So keep that in mind, keep hippocampus in mind. We'll be coming back to that. So another way to define Alzheimer's disease is in terms of these sort of hallmark pathological lesions that we see in the brain. Many of you here may have heard of amyloid. Anyone heard of amyloid? Probably most of you have heard of amyloid by now. How about tau? All right, pretty good. All right, so amyloid and tau, those are the classic defining, we call them lesions, hallmark lesions in the brain. They're basically collections, abnormal collections of protein that build up in the brain, and they affect brain function in not a great way. So this is actually how, this is where a big part of the debate comes from. So classically, this is how it's defined. You can see this is actually a picture of a slice of brain that you'd get after a brain autopsy. Probably hard for you to see right now, but you can see these little dark triangular things. That's actually a neuron. So the type of brain cell that's responsible for conducting electrical circuits that basically acts like a computer. The tau protein, you can see sort of over here, builds up inside those neurons and causes them to essentially degenerate. Amyloid, on the other hand, that builds up outside of the cells in the space that involves a bunch of other different kinds of brain cells. So the combination of these two things is what we consider to be Alzheimer's disease. But also, I mentioned neurodegeneration. The synapse, that's a term used to mean that's a connection between two of these brain cells that are responsible for the computing part of the brain. Those break down so brain cells can't communicate with one another. That's another sort of hallmark feature of Alzheimer's disease, as well as neurotransmitter system dysfunction. So these are the brain chemicals that facilitate all of this communication. So those, that's actually an early part of the disease process as well. So this here, so I mentioned the hippocampus to you, so the short-term memory part of the brain. This is actually a slice of the hippocampus, and this is a 3D depiction of it over here. Hippocampus actually means seahorse. Back in the days when the early anatomists were describing everything, they named a lot of things after nature, and if you squint really hard or use your imagination, you could see maybe that looks like a seahorse. But that's actually what it looks like sort of in a 3D representation in the brain. In a more full view of the brain, that's it living right down in the middle of this area that we call the temporal lobe. And here's an actual pathological slice of it. This is what you look like. This is what you see when you do a brain autopsy. If you can see all these dark spots in there, those are actually one of the early, pretty famous in our field, neuropathologists. His last name is Brock. He did a really famous series of staging of brain slices and trying to figure out what's this pattern, how do these things build up. And you can see this hippocampal is absolutely riddled with these plaques and tangles. And this is one of the defining features of the disease. So anytime you're trying to figure out what a disease is and how it works, you see you have to figure out what's going on that's not normal, and you have to try to figure out if that thing that you've identified isn't normal is actually contributing to the clinical disease that you see. But this has been very consistent throughout the whole history of studying Alzheimer's disease, very consistent feature of Alzheimer's disease. And then you can see back in this, for a more full view of the brain, all these little dark spots. So that's just sort of graphically showing where these things tend to build up. They start in this area of the temporal lobe where this hippocampus is, eventually end up in this area called the parietal lobe. A little bit later, classically end up in the frontal parts of the brain, but it gives you a lot of the classic features of Alzheimer's disease. And that's the important point. You've got this pathology building up in different parts of the brain. Different parts of the brain do different kinds of things. Might be short-term memory, might be your language ability to be able to come up with names. It might be the part of your brain that allows you to keep track of yourself in the three-dimensional world and be able to navigate. Those are like the three classic things that go kind of early on in Alzheimer's disease. It's because of the way this pathology builds up. And this goes back quite a while. This goes back to 1906. Dr. Alzheimer, he made a discovery. These are drawings of his that he's one of these early anatomists that started figuring this out, and he was noticing these plaques and tangles in the brain with they used a stain made out of silver. And they were actually, when you take just a piece of any kind of tissue for the body, it's all just kind of a big homogeneous mush, and it's hard to differentiate one thing from another, especially if you're looking at single cells, but these particular stains allow them to do that. And he noticed these ghost-like tangles in there, and he called them neurofibrillary tangles. And it was a novel finding, and they presented a famous case. Auguste D is this woman here who had a senile dementia, as they called it back then, and they did a neuropathological examination of her and found these. And through a series of papers, they ended up publishing this, and then his contemporary, Emil Kraepelin, ended up coining the term Alzheimer's disease after Mr. Alzheimer. So initially, this was considered to be a rare form, a more early onset and more severe form, in contrast with what people typically considered later onset senile dementia. So that was 1906. It took until the 1980s and 90s where a bunch of scientists across the world put a bunch of pieces together and came up with the current prevailing theory of what Alzheimer's disease is. And a series of discoveries. Number one, that maybe some of you have heard this, but patients with Alzheimer's disease, Down syndrome, virtually 100%, if they live long enough, chance of getting Alzheimer's disease. And it just happens to be the way the genetics works out. The same thing that happens with your genes that gives you Down syndrome puts you at a higher risk of building up this amyloid protein. And it was discovered that it was exactly the same amyloid protein in patients with Down syndrome as we were seeing in older people who were having our typical Alzheimer's disease. There was also the discovery that there's the precursor of this amyloid protein. So most proteins start off in a more primitive form, and then they're processed and then eventually becoming the product that's useful for the body. So this amyloid precursor protein, this is basically the envelope of a cell. We've got gazillion cells in our bodies. They all have a membrane or an envelope, and lots of our proteins sit on the surface of these things. So this amyloid precursor protein sits on the cell membrane, and it's got a bunch of enzymes, basically machines that chop it up and make it into useful products. There are useful and healthy ways to process this to allow amyloid to do its normal functioning, but there are bad ways that it can be processed as well. And one of the things that happens in Alzheimer's disease is this amyloid gets processed abnormally, and it causes it to build up in the brain rather than serve a lot of its normal functions. So another discovery was that early onset, so a lot of these familial forms of Alzheimer's disease, these are families that lots of people get it, tends to be early on. There was the discovery that this amyloid precursor protein was responsible for that in some of these people. So those two things put together, in 1992, a paper was published on what's called the now famous Amyloid Cascade hypothesis. So the idea that this buildup of amyloid is the beginning stages of Alzheimer's disease, and that, and I'll explain a little bit more what that means at the beginning. But this ushered in up to the current time. If anyone who's been involved in any clinical trials, there's a lot of focus on amyloid, and it all comes back to this series of events starting in 1906 and up until the 90s. But this wasn't universally accepted at the beginning, and still hasn't been. It's actually been, ever since then, there's been a great deal of debate about this. Particularly snarky title from back around that time, the Amyloid Cascade Hypothesis of Alzheimer's disease, a decoy or the real McCoy. There's been, so from the very beginning, as often is the case in science, real spirited debate on people go into these fields and study them and put their heart and soul into them and have a lot of strong opinions about what's right and what isn't. So, and that's what makes science great. This is what helps us advance and figure out, separate the wheat from the chaff. So there's been a lot of very rigorous debate about this over the years, but it's come down to the more, in the recent era, the amyloid cascade hypothesis has for the most part prevailed. And this is a now famous graph depicting the pathological progression of Alzheimer's disease. So if you can't read it here, this first, I mentioned that amyloid is considered to be the first part of Alzheimer's disease. You get that amyloid buildup in the brain, and then it leads to this cascade hypothesis of other things happening. So this is on the bottom line here. This is normal. This is kind of like your spectrum of normal brain aging, sort of normal cognition, and then dementia here at the end, and then mild cognitive impairment in the middle. Mild cognitive impairment is kind of a gray zone between normal forgetfulness for aging and then dementia. Maybe when you have mild cognitive impairment, you're a little bit more forgetful than we'd expect for your age, but you can function in daily life for the most part independently, even if it's a little bit more difficult. So early amyloid buildup, at some point leading to this tau buildup in the brain. So the darker blue color is that tau. And then these two changes eventually leading to this yellow line here, which depicts structural changes in the brain, this neurodegenerative stuff that I showed you that picture of. Eventually, so all of this going on in the background before someone even notices memory impairment, so eventually leading to memory impairment and then eventually leading to decline in functional independence in daily life. So this is the hypothesis that's driven a lot of our research and a lot of the clinical trials recently. But you can understand, it makes sense, just from what we've seen in these studies going back to Dr. Alzheimer's with amyloid and tau. And it's led to some pretty interesting therapies. And this is, I'm bringing us right up to the current era here, where we can take advantage of a peculiarity of the immune system. Has anyone ever heard of an antibody? Yeah, okay, probably. So an antibody, that's a natural part of the immune system. The immune system's job is to figure out what belongs in the body and what doesn't, flag the things that don't belong there for removal, and sort of help to get everything out. And it's basically a flag. It recognizes things that are dangerous and signals other parts of the immune system to get rid of them. Some very, very clever people, probably 30, 40 years ago, figured out how to take advantage of this property of the immune system for research and more recently medicine. So you can actually engineer an antibody to recognize anything you want. These antibodies have tremendous sensitivity. So you can, for example, engineer an antibody to recognize amyloid in the brain, and then that would automatically signal other parts of the immune system to remove that. And it's a very clever idea, and that's the basis for some of our most current treatments for Alzheimer's disease. So the idea is you come into our center or Butler or another center near you, and you're part of one of these research programs, and you get an infusion because you can't take these as pills. It's typically a 1 or 2 hour infusion. You get them once a month or so, and typically it's for an hour, hour and a half, 2 hours. And basically over time, you're allowing you're enhancing the immune system's capability to recognize amyloid and to remove it. And so how do you know whether or not it's working? Another recent development is we have a kind of imaging called PET imaging. Different than an MRI or a CAT scan. Those are useful for understanding the structure of the brain, but PET scans can do a lot of things, but one thing they can do is to actually look for certain kinds of proteins. So there's a particular PET scan called an amyloid PET scan where you can actually see amyloid in the brain of a living person. And this in and of itself is a miraculous change in our ability to be able to detect and potentially treat Alzheimer's disease, because for the first time you can actually see in a walking person amyloid in the brain, and you can image people over time to see how it changes in response to treatment. So this is a pretty famous paper that came out a couple years ago. And aducanumab, has anyone heard of aducanumab? Probably, it's been in the news a lot lately. I'll come back to that. So this was a study that came out as one of the first of these antibody agents to demonstrate some kind of effect. And so these are amyloid scans. All the red stuff here is amyloid in the brain. So this would be someone who has Alzheimer's disease who started the study, and then a year later they either got placebo, which means you think you're getting the drug but you're not getting it, and everyone else thinks you're getting it, and then 3 different concentrations, and it showed a really good job of removing amyloid actually from the brain. So this was a striking enough conclusion that this also ended up in the journal Nature. But it's one thing to show that this amyloid antibody can remove amyloid from the brain, but it's another thing, as I mentioned before, identifying something that's potentially wrong with the brain and showing that it correlates with the clinical disease itself are 2 different things. So unfortunately, and much to the dismay of the field, a lot of energy has gone into this. Up until pretty recently, the results in terms of people's cognitive functions and their function in daily life has proven a lot more disappointing than the scan results. It's been a big blow for us, and there was a big event this past March where, and this involved a lot of, we had patients in this very trial where they have to do all these safety checks when these trials they're big and expensive, potentially, there's potential side effects. They have to make sure that it's working the way they think it's going to in order to proceed. So usually halfway through the study, they look at the data that they have. If it looks like it's going in the right direction, great. If it doesn't look like it's going in the right direction, they have to make a call, and they had to close this trial early, and it sent shockwaves throughout the Alzheimer's research field, because we've been putting a lot of energy into this amyloid cascade hypothesis for a while, and there have been a fair amount of recent failures, and this was a big one, and it was actually causing a lot of the industry to rethink their commitment to funding Alzheimer's research. In fact, so this was March of 2019. Just to give you an idea of how difficult it's been to get a drug approved in Alzheimer's disease, the last drug to be approved for clinical use in Alzheimer's disease was Memantine. Anyone heard of Memantine? Probably a lot of you have heard of Memantine. So good old Memantine, 2003, that was the last drug to be approved for clinical use in Alzheimer's disease. All that time with all these trials, and nothing approved since then. And I'll give if it works, quick shout out to Dr. Ott. Our illustrious Dr. Ott here was actually part of these clinical trials with Memantine. But real dry spell for Alzheimer's disease. It's been a tough road for a long time. I'm talking about us as researchers, but for you too. We're working for you. We're trying to find, for patients, caregivers. It's a tough field to work in when you don't have a whole lot to offer, and it's a tough dry spell. So that was treating this amyloid cascade hypothesis, as I put it. But there are other mechanisms. I mentioned these neurotransmitters, these brain chemicals that get low in Alzheimer's disease. So what if maybe you could boost those neurotransmitter levels up? Maybe that would help. That actually turns out to be the most successful therapeutic option that we've had so far. So we have currently 4 medications that we use for Alzheimer's disease. Memantine that I just mentioned. The rest of them are all related: donepezil, galantamine, and Exelon, if anyone's heard of any of those. Those all work on this. It's called the cholinergic hypothesis. So there's a brain chemical called acetylcholine, which is one of the brain chemicals that helps out with memory. And that's actually, that was even before Memantine was approved. So this is the era we've been in for a while. So the only things that have worked so far have been working on this cholinergic hypothesis, or helping out. Memantine works with some of the toxic brain chemicals that end up leading to neurodegeneration. Another shout out to Dr. Ott. So he was involved in one of actually Tacrin, which isn't used anymore, but that was another one of these cholinesterase inhibitors, as we call them. Rhode Island's, somebody say something? Rhode Island is actually, believe it or not, little old Rhode Island has played a pretty prominent place in the history of Alzheimer's disease going way back. So just so you don't think this wasn't all for a lack of effort, the fact that we haven't found a new drug since 2003, this is a very busy graph, but just to give you a visual depiction of, this is the 2019 drug clinical pipeline for Alzheimer's disease. This is just for 2019, all of the different drugs that are currently in clinical trials, different stages of clinical trials. Phase 1, where it's more, is it something that can be safely tolerated by people? Phase 3 is where you've gone through all of that, you think it's going to do something, and you try it on a larger scale group of patients. But lots and lots of drugs, and this is what the pipeline looks like every year. But it's been a tremendously difficult problem to solve. Hopefully you're starting to get a little bit of an idea of why that might be, but I'm going to explain a little bit more of that. So part of the problem is, despite this amyloid cascade hypothesis, it's actually quite difficult to define what Alzheimer's disease is. As I alluded to, it's, on the one hand, it's this clinical syndrome where you have memory problems that progress over time and eventually to the point where you can't drive or manage your finances or things like that anymore. That's the clinical side of it. The other side of it is what we see on brain autopsy and the buildup of this amyloid and tau and all that. Turns out it's been actually kind of hard to correlate the overall burden of amyloid in the brain with the clinical symptoms. Tau, on the other hand, has been a lot more reliable that way. So the more tau you have, there's more of a reliable pattern of tau buildup in the brain that correlates with the clinical aspect of the disease. But this is just a quick snapshot of, so I mentioned tau and amyloid, but they're not completely specific to Alzheimer's disease. In fact, one way to describe Alzheimer's disease is as a tauopathy. So it's a brain disorder that involves tau, but there are other tauopathies. Frontotemporal dementia is a tauopathy. There are others. The chronic traumatic encephalopathy, this is a new and debated topic, but this is with the NFL, the football players, boxers, and things like that. That actually, when you look at the brains of those patients, they have the same tau, but it's in a little bit of a distribution. So tau isn't unique to Alzheimer's disease, and neither is amyloid. There are other of these. So tau and amyloid aren't the only proteins that build up. There's one called alpha-synuclein that builds up in brains of patients with Parkinson's disease, as well as Lewy body disease. That's another related dementia that's related to Alzheimer's disease. There's a whole bunch of other ones. I won't bore you with that, but hopefully you get the picture is that we talk about amyloid and tau and Alzheimer's disease, but it's not necessarily specific to Alzheimer's disease. So can we really say that this is the basis of defining the disease? Maybe, but I think we still have a lot to figure out about that. In fact, there have been a lot of studies, big studies, where you take hundreds of thousands of patients who have donated their brains for brain autopsy. And that's the point. With brain autopsy, you can look under a microscope and see everything that's going on. But the more you look, the more you see how actually homogeneous all of this, meaning, it's not really clear when you look at a brain under a microscope if it's Alzheimer's disease, is it Lewy body disease, is it something else? The older people get, the more pathologies they build up. So in this pie here, this was just one study of all the brains they looked at. Under 45% of them, so these were patients that presumably had Alzheimer's disease. Less than half of them actually had just pure Alzheimer's pathology. A big chunk of them, almost 30%, had vascular disease and Alzheimer's disease pathologies, so disease of the tiny blood vessels of the brain that we'll get to in a little bit. Another pretty big chunk, almost 17%, had a mix of Alzheimer's disease and Lewy body disease pathology. And then the more you look, the more you find that there's a mix of just about everything. So, if you think about it, if you can't actually define a disease and you can't tell what causes it and when it starts, how do you figure out how to treat it? So really, it's a big problem, and this is one of the big problems with Alzheimer's research. It's this closed thing, the brain. It's a mystery. You've got disease going on for decades before you can identify them in a person, and when you really look at it, it's really hard to even define it. So this has caused a lot of us to question, well, maybe we don't really know what Alzheimer's disease is. Maybe this amyloid cascade hypothesis, there's probably a lot to it, but maybe it's not the whole story. So does amyloid really lead to tau buildup? Is it this linear progression? Part of the problem is, until recently, we haven't been able to follow somebody's natural history over time. So somebody, you see what they looked like when they were 50, 60, 70, 80, and what actually the trend is. Does amyloid, the presumption with the amyloid cascade hypothesis is that there's this sort of linear buildup of it, the sort of inevitable progression that builds up over time, and that inevitably leads to tau buildup, which inevitably leads to neurodegeneration. But we don't really know that that's the case, because all of our assumptions about this have been built upon taking all these autopsy studies of people who happen to pass away at different ages and different stages of the disease, and basically extrapolating a pattern, which makes sense in a lot of ways, but we're starting to stumble into some of the pitfalls of this inevitable part of the research. Maybe there's some other factor more downstream, more upstream, I should say, that we haven't fully identified yet, that is causing the amyloid buildup or the tau buildup or the neurodegeneration. Maybe they're all separate processes that are related, that influence one another, and there's maybe not a one-size-fits-all for this. Maybe different people have different risks and different paths that lead to the same, essentially, collection of clinical syndromes at some point. So this gets us, with that background, a little bit more into the heart of the topic. So we're talking about vascular lifestyle, and in parentheses, I mostly mean, at least for the current talk, vascular risk factors for Alzheimer's disease. So we're going to talk about what vascular disease is in the brain, why it matters. White matter is the thing we're looking at here primarily. So why does white matter matter? And a lot of it has to do with the blood vessels in our brain and inflammation. So this is not a new idea, as you can imagine. There's been, from my mentioning of this being a debated topic over the years, so there's been a number of different theories about what Alzheimer's disease is. So again, going back to, this is a paper back in 2000, there's a scientist who's been very vocal in the field who has promoted something called the CATCH hypothesis. It's an acronym meaning critically attained threshold for cerebral hypoperfusion. So what that means in real English is hypoperfusion is not getting enough blood into an area, so not getting enough blood into the brain. So cerebral hypoperfusion, not getting enough blood into the brain, and reaching this critical threshold. So maybe it slows down over time, eventually gets to the point where it leads to brain dysfunction. So I won't go into the details of this, but if you think about all the things in the rest of the body that diseased blood vessels do, heart disease, you can get kidney disease. If you've got diabetes, like bad diabetes, you can get foot ulcers and degeneration of your retina, all these things. So diseased blood vessels do terrible things all over the body, and the brain is no different. In fact, it might even be more prone to a lot of these things. So this is a question, this is actually something that people have been thinking about for way longer than 100 years. So some of the earliest, even back to 300s BC or so, people noticed that something was going on with people where suddenly, and they were not acting like themselves, they were becoming forgetful. But people didn't live quite as long back then. So most of what this disease that we see in people in their 70s or 80s wasn't nearly as prevalent, but they tend to notice a lot more things that what we would call stroke now. They called it apoplexy back then, but the early anatomists noticed that there was something going on with the blood flow in the brain. They might notice big pockets of blood that aren't supposed to be there, but that, the idea of blood vessels affecting brain function goes back a very, very long time. And classically, so this is getting back to vascular dementia. I mentioned that vascular dementia is the second leading cause of dementia. But this has also been a very difficult thing to understand. So classically, vascular dementia is more akin to what we call post-stroke dementia. So you're normal one day, you have a stroke, and then you have cognitive deficits after that that were clearly as a result of your stroke. That's one of the classic definitions of vascular dementia. And if you can see this, classically, so rather than the gradual progression, as you can see here, this green line is the gradual progression of Alzheimer's disease with your deficits. Vascular dementia tends to have more of this step-like progression. You're doing okay, you have a little stroke, something isn't quite right, you sort of persist, you're stable from there, you have another little stroke, you have another deficit that you notice, this more stepwise progression, rather than the gradual progression that we typically see in Alzheimer's disease. And this depicts all these little holes here are tiny little strokes, ischemic strokes, meaning you've lost blood flow to the brain and had damage to that part of the brain. You can have tiny ischemic strokes, and you can have very large ischemic strokes that can take out half the brain, and everything in between. But there, as I also showed you, there's a mix. So people can have Alzheimer's disease and strokes at the same time. So there's sort of an intermediate designation that we call mixed dementia, where it's pretty clear that there's a little bit of both going on. So this is the classic, the risk factors for stroke and vascular dementia are the traditional vascular risk factors that we think of for heart disease. So all the same stuff: high blood pressure, high cholesterol, diabetes, smoking, getting older, being obese, being more sedentary, et cetera. But it's a little bit more complicated than that, as you might imagine. So not everybody whose brain has been affected by some aspect of vascular function has had a clear stroke and a clear stepwise progression in their symptoms. There are some more insidious ways that blood vessel dysfunction in the brain can affect brain functioning. And I'd like to define for you a couple of terms: gray matter and white matter. Anyone heard of gray matter, white matter? So gray matter is this ribbon on the outside of the brain. We often call it the cortex. This is basically the computational part of the brain. I showed you these triangular shaped neurons that do all the computations. Billions and billions of them live in the cortex. They're doing all this complex computation. But in order to be a really effective machine, it's got to be able to communicate all this information all over the brain. That's where the white matter comes in. The white matter is all this stuff that lies underneath the cortex, and you can see these cables that run. These are just some of the main cable tracks, but basically white matter almost literally is biological wires that conduct electrical currents between all the computational parts of the brain and bring about this incredible synchrony and coordination of the most complex piece of matter in the known universe, actually, this 3-pound universe, if anyone's ever read that. So white matter is tremendously important. So there are lots and lots and lots and lots of blood vessels in the brain. This figure over here depicts just a small fraction of it, but tremendous amount of tiny, from large to small to very, very tiny blood vessels in the brain. And there's a bunch of different ways that blood vessel disease of the brain can manifest. So this is for small vessel disease. You can have what's called leukoariosis, which is the typical white matter disease. If anyone's looked at a brain MRI and seen these white patches, probably a lot of you have heard of that or seen it before. But this is the typical white matter disease that we see for a lot of patients in the clinic. That's due to these tiny blood vessels eventually getting thickened and stiffened and eventually not working, and eventually closes off, and it gives this appearance on imaging of this white patch. But these vessels can do a lot of other things. They can cause these tiny little ischemic infarcts that I showed you. Actually, that amyloid protein also builds up in a lot of these vessels and gives us what's called cerebral amyloid angiopathy, so it basically makes these blood vessels leaky and prone to bleeding. You get these microbleeds in the brain. A lot of other stuff going on with the brain. So this white matter disease is nowhere near as clear in terms of its contribution to someone's cognitive function as a stroke. So you have a stroke in a big vessel of the brain, you knock out a big part of the brain, it's pretty obvious that you've had result of that. But when you have these build up, tiny little spots that build up slowly over time, and it's a really slow process. So it's hard to study. And it's also, the pattern tends to vary so much between people that it's really hard to clinically measure it and see how it's contributing to someone's disease scores. But getting back to this, when you look at, and I just showed you numbers from this one study, but generally speaking, when you look at the number I see when I look at all these studies is on average, half of the Alzheimer's, pathologically confirmed Alzheimer's cases that you look at under a microscope, about half of them have at least some degree of at least subtle microvascular disease, so disease of the small blood vessels of the brain. And this is the same disease that happens in your arteries and everything else that leads to heart disease and stroke and all of these other things. So this is part of the momentum that's leading a lot of other people to start thinking about, well, how can maybe we can rethink what Alzheimer's disease is, and maybe there's some other avenues that we could use for treatment. So another way to look at Alzheimer's disease is that it's an inflammatory disorder. So even the amyloid plaques themselves, this is an artist's description of this amyloid plaque that lives between all these nerve cells. This is really busy and you're not meant to actually read it, but it's a complicated diagram that all these little red and yellow and blue boxes are different chemicals that are related to inflammatory processes. When you look at what an amyloid plaque actually is, it's basically a seething ball of inflammatory reaction. And that's known to be a really important part of the disease process. It's not just that this amyloid's there, it's that it's triggering a big inflammatory response locally right there in the brain. Turns out, though, that this microvascular disease that I mentioned is also involved in an inflammatory process. So in fact, there's this thing called the blood-brain barrier. So the brain is one of the parts of the body, the main part of the body that its function is so highly specialized that it needs a really specific kind of environment to do it. It's what it needs to do. It can't just have everything that's floating around in the blood end up in the brain because it'll perturb brain functioning. So the blood-brain barrier keeps all of the stuff in the blood that doesn't belong in the brain out of the brain, allows the stuff that the brain needs into the brain, and also helps to remove all of the waste from the brain back out to the bloodstream. So a properly functioning blood-brain barrier is tremendously important for the overall maintenance and function of the brain. But it turns out that this white matter disease is also a big inflammatory process. In fact, part of the function of the inner lining of a blood vessel that's in the blood-brain barrier is to signal the rest of the body when there's a danger in the brain to recruit immune cells into the brain. So that's part of what this inflammatory process ends up leading to. So there's been a lot of research lately starting to try to get an idea of how are these two processes. Both of them are, inflammation is involved both with amyloid buildup and also with the small vessel disease. How are these processes different and how are they the same? Maybe they're part of the same thing, maybe they're different but related. Another busy graph, but just to give you an idea. So this is all led to, so it turns out this is not all just happening in the brain. Aging itself, under certain circumstances, is an inflammatory process. A lot of the age-associated chronic diseases at their core have some degree of inflammation involved, and it's so present in so many people in so many age-related disorders that there's been a new term defined called inflammaging. So inflammation aging. And it's a new concept in fields of aging, biology, and gerontology in general, but being applied more and more to Alzheimer's disease. And in fact, all of these vascular risk factors that I've been mentioning, or a lot of them, cholesterol, plaques in your blood vessels, high blood pressure, diabetes, obesity, so actual fat tissue in your body is pro-inflammatory. All of these things actually at their core have a low-grade inflammatory process going on. So maybe there's something uniting all of these things. Maybe this is a key to, maybe all of Alzheimer's disease doesn't start in the brain. Maybe some of it starts in the body. So this gets us to the actual topic of our lengthy background to the actual topic of our talk here. So vascular risk factors. So now hopefully you have a little bit of an understanding of where we've come from in our understanding of what Alzheimer's disease is, how our thinking over time about the involvement of blood vessels in the brain has evolved over time. And then if that's the case, if blood vessel disease has some potential role in Alzheimer's disease, there must be some associated risk between all these vascular risk factors that we know about with heart disease and such and Alzheimer's disease. So new concept, vascular risk factors for dementia. I'll take a quick step back. The traditional risk factors, the strongest risk factors that we've identified so far, there are three main ones. Hands down, the strongest risk factor for Alzheimer's disease is age. So when you're 65 years old, if you don't have any other things that might increase your risk for Alzheimer's disease, if you got somewhere in the neighborhood of a 2 or 3% chance of having some degree of Alzheimer's changes in your brain, whether or not you have dementia, that risk doubles every 5 years, to the point where by the time you get to be about 85, you've got somewhere around a 45% chance of having Alzheimer's changes in the brain. Again, not necessarily dementia. That's hands down the strongest risk factor that we know of for Alzheimer's disease. But there are these other things, this ApoE. Anyone heard of ApoE? So this is a gene that's a risk factor for Alzheimer's disease. Kind of like saying, not the kind of risk gene where often in medicine where if it's positive, it means you definitely have the thinking you're looking for. If it's negative, it means you don't. It just puts you at a higher degree of risk. It might double your risk at 65 for having Alzheimer's disease, but it's a relative doubling. So if you have a otherwise 2% risk for Alzheimer's disease, if you double it, it's only a 4% risk. And that gets a little bit fuzzier the older you get. It doesn't double your 45% chance when you're 85, but it's a lot more complicated than that. And a family history of Alzheimer's disease has a similar effect. It can double your risk when you're younger from 2 to 4%, but then again, it's a lot fuzzier. But these are the strongest risk factors that we've been able to identify so far. And I'm just mentioning here that these risk factors, for the most part, modify your age-associated risk in general. That's not entirely true, but generally speaking. So getting back to our vascular risk factors and our topic of vascular risk factors for Alzheimer's disease, again, physical activity, tobacco cessation, nutritional, alcohol use, hypertension, hyperlipidemia, all of these kinds of things. So there have been lots of studies on this. It's actually been an incredible couple of years. I just started fellowship 2 years ago, a year fellowship, and started on faculty a year ago. And I mentioned I've been interested in this for a long time, since I was working on Alzheimer's disease in the early 2000s, doing research projects. But over the past couple of years, there's been an incredible, almost an avalanche of different studies with these, we call it epidemiological studies. So epidemiology is where you basically take a population of people and you follow them over time and you figure out the trends of diseases in populations. One way to do that is that you take a whole bunch of people who don't have the thing that you're looking for, follow them over time, measure a bunch of stuff. Eventually, some percentage of that population will have, for example, Alzheimer's disease or something else you're looking for. Then you can look at all your data and figure out what the commonalities were and figure out what actually causes it. There have been a lot of these studies that have recently come out, 5 years, 10 years, 20-year-long studies that have looked at all these different separate vascular risk factors that I've mentioned to you, like high blood pressure and such. And the bottom line is all of these factors, if you have high blood pressure or high cholesterol, any of these at midlife, it increases your risk for eventual, even Alzheimer's-related cognitive decline in later life. I'm not going to, it's a bewildering number of studies, and I'm not going to go through all of those, but I have a couple here that I thought were really intriguing that I wanted to describe to you. This one here is particularly intriguing, both in the design and actually the number of study participants. So this is in the United Kingdom Biobank study. They followed almost 200,000 patients over a period of 7 to 10 years. And they looked at a couple of different things. On the one hand, And they were just following people over time that didn't have dementia. And they wanted to see what affected their baseline level of quality of life in terms of health behaviors, how that influenced their risk for dementia over time. So they categorized them into either having a very unfavorable lifestyle, a very favorable lifestyle, or an intermediate lifestyle. So there's 3 different rows here. All 3 of them have favorable, intermediate, and unfavorable lifestyle. And then they also categorized them into people who had different levels of genetic risk. I mentioned ApoE, but there's a bunch of other genes that we've more recently started to look into. But you can categorize people into what level of genetic risk they have for potentially developing dementia. So they also grouped these people into high, medium, and low genetic risk. And these over here, so this is a complicated plot, but the main idea is the further the green dot ends up over to the right of the chart, the higher your risk for dementia is. So if you look at the top one here, these were people who had low genetic risk. The people who had the most unfavorable, so low genetic risk, the most unfavorable lifestyle, when you compared them to people with low genetic risk and the most favorable lifestyle, you had a much higher chance of developing dementia over time with an unfavorable lifestyle compared with a favorable lifestyle. If you take people with medium genetic, so this intermediate genetic, medium genetic risk, same pattern emergence. People who have an unfavorable lifestyle are at a greater risk for people who have a very favorable lifestyle. And then again, the same pattern emergence for people who have a high degree of genetic risk. Again, the people who happen to take really good care of themselves had a lower chance of developing dementia than people had who did not take very good care of themselves. And you can see, so there's an intersection between your genetics and your behavior. So it's really maybe not all just a predetermined one-fits-all thing. You know, maybe some of it has to do with our genetics and our brains and our particular disposition. Some of it, a fair amount of it, might have to do with choices that we make in our lives over the course of many decades in our lives. Interestingly, well, I already sort of described that to you. So this is another study. So this is for this is your lifestyle risk for dementia. You know, and again, so how you differentiate dementia and Alzheimer's disease depends on who you ask in the research community. But this wasn't specific for Alzheimer's disease per se, but another study looked at vascular risk, similar kind of idea, but they actually they tried to define the development of amyloid buildup in the brain, which is sort of the gold standard right now for identifying and labeling Alzheimer's disease. So what they did, a little bit different for this one, they followed people over a shorter period of time. There were, I forget a lot, not 20,000, 346, but that's a pretty good number for most studies. And what they did is they looked at the total number of risk factors that people had, of all these risk factors that I mentioned, and they categorized them. People who had more than 2 risk factors, high blood pressure, high cholesterol, diabetes, people who had 1 risk factor or none, and they followed them over time, over it was a 10-year or so time period. And similar, so in this trend, so people who had, so each of those circles there are the people who had more than 2 risk factors, and these are all the people who had the highest risk for building up amyloid in the brain over time. So you've got a couple of different studies that are echoing a lot of what some of the other studies are saying. So increased risk of dementia, that might be all different kinds of dementia mixed together, and even in some studies, specific risk for amyloid pathology, which is what we equate to Alzheimer's disease. And importantly, these were midlife risk factors. So in your 40s and 50s, if you had some combination of vascular risk factors, and the more you had, the greater risk you had. So midlife vascular risk factors setting you up for higher chance of having dementia or Alzheimer's disease in later life. So all of it can be boiled down. There's a pretty nice, and there are references. I understand these are going to be, the slides are going to be shared. There's references for all these studies at the end of the lecture. But it can be summarized as there was a great review that came out this is another very high-level journal called The Lancet. And they a couple of years ago, they went over all of this stuff and came up with a concept. And again, so these are all those risk factors that we talked about. But this is a timeline of life. So one of the trends, one of the pictures about your vascular risk for dementia is that it's not just these particular risk factors that put you at higher risk. It's that you have, at different points in your lifespan, different things influence your risk for dementia in different ways. So having hypertension at 30 versus 50 versus 89 might not influence your risk for dementia in the same way. And this is hard to fit on one slide and have you read it at the same time, so I've broken it down a little bit. This gets you in early life. So education is, for a long time, we've known that education level it influences your basically resilience for cognitive decline. There's a concept that we call cognitive reserve. And basically the idea is over the span of your life, starting early on, the more you use your brain, essentially the more connections you make. The more connections you make, the more you can stand to lose. That's a very simplistic way of understanding it. There's probably a lot more to it than that, but that's the general idea. And we see that a lot. People who are very highly functioning can seem to be able to withstand a lot more insult to their brain before they start to have clinical symptoms. So early on, education is a factor. And then when you get to midlife, at least this, as of a couple of years ago, this is when they looked at the data, this is they saw it's constantly changing, but hearing loss is another big one. We in our clinic harp on people on getting, lots of people lose hearing later on and getting a hearing assessment and getting hearing aids if you need them. Hearing loss, hypertension, and obesity in midlife, at least according to this review, were at midlife were the primary drivers of later life risk for dementia. And then in later life, smoking, depression, physical activity, social isolation, and diabetes. So again, going from early life to midlife to late life, different factors over time influencing your risk for dementia in different ways. And the real important part about this is, and I've seen different estimates on this, but the currently accepted estimate is that somewhere around 35% of your risk, if you combine all of these risk factors together, potentially somewhere around 35% of your risk for developing dementia is potentially modifiable, meaning that you could decrease the risk of that factor on influencing you getting dementia. So it's a pretty powerful concept. We're getting to the point where we don't have to think about Alzheimer's disease as being an inevitably progressive thing that we can't have any influence on. It might be choices that we make in our lives may have a big influence on that, and not to make you feel bad about yourselves, because we all do the same things, but the flip side of this is that maybe we have some measure of control over this, even up to later life. If you make some lifestyle changes, you can influence the trajectory that you're on. That's sort of the message with a lot of this. So those are, I've described for you evidence for that vascular risk factors can influence your risk, your chances of getting dementia, but are they actually modifiable? So that's another question entirely. Can you actually do something about it? Seems like you might be able to, but this is a difficult, there have been a number of attempts at this, 3 pretty well-known studies to date, but the biggest one so far is called the FINGER trial, and they've actually that's some really interesting and compelling data. So FINGER, this was done in Finland, and it stands for the Finnish Geriatric Intervention Study to Prevent Cognitive Impairment and Disability. So the acronym is FINGER. So the idea with this is, so this is what we call a multi-domain study. So they decided to take a different kind of approach than we usually take in medicine. We like to isolate things in science and medicine. We're driven by reductionist ideologies, and we want to isolate things down to what we think is the most essential factor, figure out how that influences disease, and then figure out how to treat that. But they're looking at this and saying, well, if there are all these different factors that are influencing you all at once, and we don't necessarily know, for maybe for Jane, that's the hypertension, and for Sam, it has more to do with his diabetes. Since we don't really know what the particular contributions are, and since they're all potentially related, they're related to your lifestyle, maybe even related to the pathology that's going on, inflammation and all these other things, why not treat them all together? And so what they did, they designed what's called a multi-domain study. So they're basically taking a whole bunch of people, putting on a bunch of different interventions that address all these factors all at once. And basically the idea is if we give people a healthy lifestyle and study them in the same way that we would study giving somebody a drug, what happens? So they took 1,260 patients, older adults, age 60 to 77. They had increased risk for vascular disease in one way or another. They were mostly normally from a cognitive standpoint, maybe performing a little bit worse than you'd expect for age. And they gave them this combination intervention where they gave them dietary counseling, exercise, cognitive training, social activities, and then monitoring and management of their risk factors in more traditional senses. And they also, they realized that group dynamics and social contacts are also important for all of this. I showed you stress at the beginning feeds into a lot of this, so they built in individual counseling and group sessions into all of this. And they actually found, so this is a field, Alzheimer's research, it's hard to find improvements in cognitive functioning. It's really difficult. They had some great results. So 25% or more overall improvement in cognitive function. And if they broke it down to different processes, so certain aspects of cognition improved quite a bit with this combination of interventions. And they ended up having, this is still ongoing. The last data I saw was about 5 years out. But at that point, we're seeing a lower risk for overall cognitive decline. And again, that's hard to do in several years when it's a disease that's, as I described to you, decades and decades in the making. So some pretty promising results. And this was, they showed some improvement regardless of participants' gender, age, education, vascular risk profile, or their baseline cognitive performance. So, still a lot of work to be done, but in our world, where we haven't had a new drug approved since 2003, and you saw the size of that pipeline, and it looks like that every year, maybe something as simple as changing people's lifestyle could reduce your risk by, even if it's half of 35%. That's a lot better than what we currently have. We don't know, the jury's still out, but it's encouraging news. And there's a lot of, I'm gonna, in a moment, finish up by giving you a taste of a little bit of the science. So you might ask, well, so I don't know, you guys are a little late to the game with this vascular risk factor modification stuff. Cardiologists have been doing this for a while, stroke doctors have been doing this for a while with a lot of success. Wouldn't you have expected to see some improvement in treatment of heart disease and stroke in dementia risk? Turns out that's the case. We've actually noticed over the years, if you compare the early 1990s to the 2008-11 era where this was done, for each age category, there's less people with Alzheimer's dementia than in the late 2000s compared to the early 90s. So for pretty much each age category, if you look at, except for 75 to 79, who knows, but so the red bar is the late 2000s, and the gray bar is the 90s. For each age range, there's fewer people per age group who have Alzheimer's than there were 10 or 15 years ago. And we all know that, you sure have heard that Alzheimer's, the total number of people with Alzheimer's disease is expected to triple by the year 2050. But that's because the baby boomer population is becoming a larger segment of the population. But the underlying trend is actually that per age group, there's less dementia. And we think that has something to do with all of these changes in lifestyle that we've done to try to treat other, turns out potentially related diseases like heart disease and stroke. So with the success of the finger study, it's now, there was a great pilot and lots of people want to replicate it. So there's the finger trial, so they've coined this term worldwide fingers, and there's a whole bunch of sister studies that are going on all over the world. There's a map depicting that, pretty much all the way across North America, Australia, India, China. Obviously, they started off in Finland, a bunch of places in Europe, but basically replicating these studies across the world, adapting them a little bit for the cultures. Not everyone wants to eat the same food, but the general idea is that it's healthy stuff and you stay active and you keep yourself cognitively engaged. One in the US as well. We start off with finger. This one's called US Pointer. The acronym is too hard to remember, but it's a catchy phrase. So, you know, this is, in fact, US Pointer is actually sponsored by the Alzheimer's Association. So the fact that we've gotten to the point where the Alzheimer's Association is, I can't possibly express to you the impact that that's had on our field. It's an enormous organization. They do incredible amounts for us, and it's a very high profile organization in Alzheimer's research. The fact that they're putting their weight and their money behind an intervention like this, I think speaks volumes for where we're going. So we're going to take a little bit of a deeper dive. I just wanted to give you a taste of some of the more exciting science that's coming up that explains a lot of this, but you've probably seen a lot of news articles about interesting studies coming out recently. Again, just getting back to this, this is something I'm particularly interested in, is this concept of biological aging. So the idea is all these things we've talked about, inflammation and all these things, are really affecting most parts of the body at a very fundamental level. In fact, at the level of the cell, all the different organelles, as we call them, of each individual cell. Every cell has its own organs, essentially, that has a different task. They all become diseased in different ways that are related to energy production and stress of oxidative molecules that build up that are very harmful. I mentioned decreased energy production. They're becoming less functional and becoming senescent, as we call it. So they just exist but don't do anything, don't necessarily die off. And it affects a whole bunch of different aspects of the body. So there's a concept that I'm particularly interested, that maybe Alzheimer's disease in some respect is a factor of general biological aging. So again, related to this inflammaging, so I again mentioned, so it can be related to, so diabetes, I mentioned, is related to inflammation, atherosclerosis, cancer, of course, inflammation, aberrant immune functioning, and overall, your body changes over time. Some people just age better than others. It's something that you recognize a lot, and sometimes that aging not better than you should leads to particular kinds of diseases. So maybe there's some more commonalities that sort of unite all these things, that maybe some aspect of Alzheimer's disease is yet another manifestation of that. Exercise, this is one of my favorite topics, happens to hit these pathological cellular processes right at their fundamental core. So Alzheimer's disease, exercise directly interferes with this inflammatory process. So you can have a pro-inflammatory state where inflammation is sort of running out of check. Your body has the capability of reversing that with an anti-inflammatory state. Exercise actually naturally puts you into an anti-inflammatory state and counteracts the pro-inflammatory state. There we go. Two more quick things I want to mention. The gut microbiome has been in the media a lot. The idea is that all these bacteria that live in your intestines are supposed to be there, and they perform all sorts of vital functions for us. So there are healthy gut bacteria that break things down that we can't break for ourselves and make nutrients for ourselves. They produce things that have pharmacologic action for us. They protect us from things in the environment getting into our body that don't belong in our body. The flip side of that is if you have the wrong balance, or they call it dysbiosis, of gut bacteria, all sorts of diseases that come about. But it's not just diseases that are isolated to your gastrointestinal system. There's a lot of evidence to suggest that what's going on in your gut might be influencing your brain function. And there's a new-ish term that's been coined called the gut-brain axis. But the general idea is, so you've got, I mentioned this pro-inflammatory state. So one of the concepts is our Western diet is probably not the best thing that we were not necessarily meant to designed to eat tons of processed carbohydrates and such. Some factor in your gut balance may be affecting the balance between pro-inflammatory and anti-inflammatory states. And in fact, there was a recent announcement of I don't know the details of this yet, but I mentioned it because it was just out in the news, a brown seaweed protein that was approved in China. And it was approved for Alzheimer's disease. They claim to have had some kind of benefit from studying it in terms of cognitive or functional status in Alzheimer's patients. But the idea is that it influences the balance of your gut microbiome. One last thing I want to mention is sleep. Really interesting, recent. So this is incredibly important. We talk about it with our patients all the time. We all know that if you have a bad night of sleep, you're not on your A game. But it turns out to be potentially a lot more important for Alzheimer's disease. So I mentioned that this amyloid protein has some normal functions, has a lot of normal functions, and it's made in the brain all the time, but it's meant to be cleared. And it's meant to be cleared out into the bloodstream. But so one of the theories of Alzheimer's disease, why these build up in the brain, is because they're not cleared the way they're supposed to be. So there's been a pretty interesting recent series of developments where it's been discovered that there's this system. The rest of the body has something called the lymphatic system that's kind of parallel to the blood system, but it's not blood, but it functions to remove waste. It was supposed for a long time that the brain didn't have such a lymphatic system because it was hard to find, but there was one discovered several years ago, and it's been found that the functioning of this lymphatic system of the brain, part of it is to remove this amyloid, but it functions best in deep wave sleep, in deep sleep, slow wave sleep. A recent study, this is actually if you navigate your way to this, there's a video of it showing that pulses of slow wave sleep coordinated with blood flow movement in the brain. And this isn't just one study, there's been a whole series of studies that are really starting to develop this concept. So another aspect of lifestyle that's incredibly important. So we come down to these questions. So this is all new stuff. I think it's hopeful. I don't want to sit here and tell you that this is the answer to everything. We still have way more to learn, but we're at a crossroads right now. It's a much more, the future's starting to look a lot brighter for us, and it's an exciting era to be working. But as usual, answers beget more questions. So, questions I have right now. So if aging is related to inflammation, and inflammation and these risk factors are modifiable, is age itself to some degree modifiable? Maybe we're not all on a trajectory of chronological age. Maybe some people age faster than others in a way that you can change. And if that's the case, who's that the case for, and to what degree? And then if you're going to prescribe vascular risk factor modification, what dose do you need? How much exercise do you need? What kinds of foods do you need? And the other thing for us is, how do you figure this out? You can only do it if people get involved, and it's hard work for people to, all of this research that we do depends on dedicated people coming in and spending a whole bunch of their time and allowing us to figure this out. And these lifestyle risk factors, they're lifestyle, so it's meant to go on for a long time. So how do you get people to adopt these things and to keep doing them? So persistence does pay off. I'm going to take you on a little bit of a full circle, and I promise I'm done. So I mentioned this anti-amyloid antibody. We had this big bombshell back in March, but it turns out, and you might have noticed a week and a half or so ago in the news, there's been, they took a look at a bunch of the data that they weren't able to look at when they had to close it in March, and it turns out that there's a pretty good signal, at least in some segment of the population. So they've decided to reopen this trial, and there's actually talk about potentially getting it approved by the FDA. So we might be in the era of the first, for drugs, biological modification for Alzheimer's disease. So that's a pretty exciting first stuff. And I'm just going to finish with Maria Carrillo is actually the chief science officer for the Alzheimer's Association, and I really liked this article that she put out recently. She's really taking to heart the idea of sort of harmonizing our efforts rather than working in different areas. Alzheimer's has been pretty good at that, at coming together, but really starting to synthesize these concepts. Maybe we can start thinking about Alzheimer's disease as something that we can intervene on a whole bunch of different levels. Maybe with lifestyle interventions over the course of your lifespan. Maybe that's not enough for some people and they need an amyloid antibody or a tau antibody or some other kind of therapy later on. But the idea of really sort of looking at the big picture and really looking at the merits of all the different aspects of the science and trying to harmonize it all together. So what can you do? So I've talked a lot, and the whole idea is what can you do for yourselves? So stay informed is a big one. It's knowledge is power, and particularly with this is a global epidemic that's getting worse and worse, and we're all at risk for it. But the more informed you are, the more you can help yourself, the more you can help those around you who are affected as well. Get involved. There are a million ways to get involved in not just research for drugs or interventions, but we need vast communities to help out caregivers and to provide support for those who are affected. Lots of people have lots of support in their families, but a lot of people don't. And there's the whole global community affected by Alzheimer's that we need to be able to help as well. So, and that we can't do that sitting in our clinics. We need people's help. We want to help you, and this is all a conversation and a partnership. And have hope. We really are. We're at that point. You know, it's really with imagination and tenacity that we've gotten to the point. And as someone with Alzheimer's disease or a caregiver, you have to have that tenacity and just got to have some level of hope. But we're starting to get more hope. And stay active. That's it. I think the science is starting to speak for itself. But that's it. Thank you. Sorry I ran a little over.